Welcome to part 2 of my Fractal Design Meshify 2 mini review, covering the thermal and acoustic performance on offer. If you missed part 1, which was a detailed overview of everything, all the specs and a few design discussions, you can check that one out via the cards up there. Otherwise, if you're looking for the performance of this case, and perhaps if there are any fan setups that may help or hinder performance, hopefully this video covers everything you'd want to know. So without further ado, let's get into it. Before we can look at the results, we need to cover what we're testing. We've got a few setups to cover, so let's check those out first. Setup 1 is the case as it comes out of the box with the test system installed. Now you don't need to know the components of the test system since all the results here are relative to the same test system, but the specs are in the video description if you're curious. By default, the stock setup has a couple of included fans. Strangely enough, you get a 140mm 1000 RPM fan up front and a 120mm 1200 RPM fan to the rear. What's weird is they're going against the economies of scale with two completely different fans, which is nice since 140mm fans are typically quieter than their 120mm counterparts, but it's just a little strange. Anyway, that's setup 1. Setup 2 is adding one of my Noctua NF F12 1500 RPM test fans to the front alongside the included 140mm intake fan. Yes, it looks strange, but we're purely looking at more front intake airflow and its impact on thermals rather than a strictly realistic build or recommended suggestible build. Setup 3 explores whether the base fan position is useful for air cooling, so I added a second test fan as an intake here. Common misconception, more fans isn't necessarily better. Airflow from one direction can divert airflow traveling in a better or more useful direction from another fan, which can make the overall effect less effective. Naturally, the basement panels were removed for this setup. Then I wanted to triple check whether the top rear fan position is any good for air cooling. All previous testing I've done on this has either resulted in the same or worse performance, so I moved the second test fan from the basement to the top rear fan position as an exhaust. Well, I didn't actually move it, I just added another fan in there and I just covered the basement and disconnected the fan. So for all intents and purposes, it's moved. Yeah. Note that I've previously tested these positions in other cases as intake and exhaust, and they're typically both poor performers. Just to clarify, I've mentioned a couple of times that whether these additional fan positions in the basement and up top would be useful for air cooling. Now, that's a nod that these positions, if not good for air cooling, points towards being useful for water cooling since there's no herding of cats towards the heat sinks, you're taking the heat sinks towards the cats. So there we go, 4 setups. Now let's quickly talk about testing and then we'll get into the data. There are 2 types of tests I perform. One is the full speed stock testing, where I take the stock setup and run the case fans at full speed. Then we compare to other cases and their stock setups. Then I typically take the stock setup and limit the RPM of the stock fans to match my acoustically limited target of 37.5 dBA at 40 centimeters from the front of the case. But at full speed, the stock fans only get to 37 dBA, so I can't do that. Instead, to perform the acoustically limited testing, I've created a few setups that we just discussed with additional test fans which provide some noise overhead. So all case fans could be limited to hit the acoustic target, and then we can compare to others in an acoustically normalized fashion. Other cases that come with louder fans or more case fans don't always need additional case fans to meet the acoustic target, so some don't require more fans, but sometimes I'll add in a case fan here or there just to test out different, setups and some things like that, so it's not all strictly about the noise of the stock fans. Anyway, you'll know in the graphs when I needed or just added more fans for different testing if you spot a +1 FI or something similar in the name. Plus for additional, 1 for the number of fans, F for front, this could be top, rear, side, base, and I for intake, which could be X for an exhaust. Last point, I test with both Priority 5 and Firmark together for full load testing, and Firestrike with its combined test looping for 60% CPU load and full GPU load for a more realistic gaming style load. You can't compare these tests with any other testing from any other person doing testing on this case, but you can compare the results internally relative to my other testing since everything has been done with the same test case system. It's all been accounted for regarding variation. Last point, the CPU and GPU fan speeds are locked throughout all the testing, so we're just seeing performance changes due to the case fans changing and the speeds and all the settings for those changing. Their speeds are based, the CPU and GPU fan speeds are based on their acoustic performance on the open air test bench. So the GPU's fans are running at 50% speed, roughly 1350 RPM, and the Scythe Mugen 5's is running at 70% speed, roughly 1080 RPM. So that's the small print done. Now let's get onto the headlines. Starting with only this case's results, we'll compare to other cases in a moment. I've actually pulled the acoustically limited performance test data in with the stock full speed results, since there weren't a lot of meaningful setups to try with the included 2 fans that made more sense than the stock low front intake and rear exhaust. And that's actually not quite true, I'll discuss that in a second. Long story short, adding more fans and reducing the speed of all the case fans to meet the acoustic target actually hurts overall performance in every setup, despite the acoustic target being slightly louder than the stock max noise output. Now, I say overall performance because overall all temperatures added up from both components and tests, the stock setup is 5 degrees cooler, which isn't a lot all things considered. That's, roughly speaking, 4 times less than that, say 1¼ degrees on average for each component. Not a lot in there. However, with the front intake so low, the stock intake heavily favors GPU temperatures at the cost of CPU temperatures. So if you want to balance this out and pay a little more attention to the CPU, you could pay more for fans and get a front top intake. Now that I think of it, I could have tested the stock setup with the front fan more central than low. I'll keep that in mind for future testing. Apologies that I didn't do it this time round. So if you add more fans, you are making the overall system a touch hotter, likely due to the diverting of some of the useful airflow from the front fans out of the case before they've serviced your heat sinks. Now, bear in mind, more fans is a little hotter, but that's relative to the noise output that's being acoustically limited, and compared to the stock, it is half a decibel louder. But that's not a lot of difference. So relatively speaking, they're quite close, and adding more fans, keeping the noise in check, it is actually hotter. It's strange, but that is the case. What is interesting is if you add an additional front intake and a basement intake, in this case, the CPU lost nearly 8 degrees compared to the stock setup, which is roughly 4 degrees per test. And the GPU increased by 13 degrees, which is over 6 degrees per test. So there's plenty of potential to mix how you cool your system, but overall, according to these results, the best setup overall is the stock setup, and frankly, if you're gaming with a powerful GPU, that's the way you want to go about it. But if you're rendering or something with a CPU, you'll want to move the fans around and maybe buy a fan or 2 for, say, the front and base as intakes. So that's the internal testing covered. Let's take the stock result and the best acoustically limited result forward to compare to other cases. Starting with the stock full speed setup, the Meshify 2 Mini does well. The perforated front panel and front filter don't seem to be hindering performance very much relative to other cases, and outside of the test bench, which has no case fans, this is the quietest case until we hit the pop silent, and that thing was hotter than yours. Onto the acoustically limited testing, and again, the Meshify 2 Mini does well here. What's interesting here is the cases above didn't need additional case fans to meet the acoustic target. Now, you can interpret that as the Meshify 2 Mini is so quiet it needed help to be loud as the other cases. Or you can interpret that as those other cases have more headroom out of the box to cool better, which is true looking at the stock full speed results. They are cooler, albeit louder, although the Flow and Landcool 215 were only 1 decibel louder, and that's not a lot. So all in all, the Meshify 2 Mini gets an 8.2 out of 10. This number has sprung from a lot of normalizing of all the data points, so it's based on the numbers you've seen in the graphs. 8.2 is a damn good score. So let's wrap this whole 2-part review up into a conclusion. The combined specification score and fan bonus gave the Meshify 2 Mini a 6.6 out of 10. The build quality also scored quite highly at 7.3. Here's the breakdown if you want to take a look. Just note that not all zeros are actually zeros. Quite a few are not applicable, and those don't apply to the average, which is the total score at the end. Installation scoring is very high for this case, a total of 9.3 out of 10. Check out the breakdown if you want. Same rules apply for the zeros as before. So here we are, final scores. Here's the breakdown for the 4 categories we just went through, including any bonus or penalty points for special features that didn't fall under those categories just discussed. The Meshify 2 Mini lands at a 7.9 out of 10, which is a great score. Something none of the scoring has taken into account is, up to at this point, is the price. I don't score anything with cost in mind. It's based on how good it is, and then we take score into account after. The Meshify 2 Mini isn't a cheap case, actually one of the more expensive cases that I've looked at recently. You can pick this up for about $110, thereabouts. So let's do the extremely janky thing and do a price versus score graph, which puts the Meshify 2 Mini somewhere in the middle of the pack. So as for recommendations, first things first, you need to figure out if what you've seen is worth the money for you. That's only a you thing, I can't do that for you. As for the case, generally, outside of the cost, I think it's a great all-rounder. The performance is great. I think the included fans are thermally good and very quiet, but they are lacking a little in overhead thermally. A little, but they're still very good. However, based on the results, I don't think the majority of people are gonna need any more overhead, so you'll be left with a quiet case with good thermal performance. You'll also have a case that's super easy to build in, great for beginners, and doesn't really have a major downside apart from the price. But based on the score, even that, at worst, is a little on the pricey side, but also pretty reasonable. Now for the begging, if you want to pick this one up, give the Amazon links in the video description a click. They are affiliate links, so it will support me at no extra cost to you, and every once in a while I do get some money or a check from Amazon that helps me upgrade things like the lights, and I am still looking for a really wide or a wide angle fast lens to give a little bit more blur in the background, a little bit higher production value all round, and unfortunately that does cost a little. Back to the review for a second. Did I miss anything you were specifically looking for? Let me know down below, and if I can help you out, I will. If I managed to cover everything you were looking for, please consider giving the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more. If this one blew you away, perhaps think about supporting me on Patreon? Every little helps, and every month, typically speaking, I'll do a post with an update that's with everything that's happened since the last update, so you always know what's happening and you know what's going to happen. If you want more videos from me, they're over there. Hopefully there's something there to your liking. Otherwise, thanks for checking this one out. I'm going to wipe the sweat off my brow, and I'll catch you in the next one.